Okay, so today we're going to try something a little different. We're taking one single conversation and really going deep with it.
Yeah, a deep dive. And this one, honestly, it had me all over the place. I mean, we're going to hit health. We're going to talk about society, filmmaking, some historical stuff, even like some pretty heavy stuff about belief systems.
It is a lot, and we want to lay it all out, try to find the threads that connect everything, maybe give you some new ways to think about this stuff.
Right, new avenues to explore.
hmm
And a quick disclaimer here. Some of this is going to get into sensitive territory. We're not here to tell you what to think, just presenting the ideas from the source material, okay?
Exactly. So jumping right in, this whole thing starts with something a lot of us know all too well, back problems.
Yeah, scoliosis, injuries, all that. And right away they bring up Hippocrates, that ancient Greek physician. He was
Mhm.
big on the spine, so that's where you got to look first if you're trying to figure out disease.
It's interesting because it does make you think about how important that is, spinal health. And they go on to talk about their own experiences with back pain. And I think it's really fascinating. We hear about this one guy's whole health journey. He gets a brain scan and the diagnosis, super intense PTS, like the worst case the doctor had ever seen.
And what he does about it is even more interesting. No meds, nothing traditional. He goes all in on fish oil and B-complex vitamins, and then a ton of time in a hyperbaric chamber.
It's wild, right?
Whoa.
And he says it really helped. So you got to wonder, does this stuff actually work? I mean, neuroplasticity, they talk about that a bit, how our brains can rewire themselves. It's kind of like building new roads in a city. Maybe these treatments help the brain build those roads.
It's a possibility. And this idea of the brain's ability to heal and change, that comes up again later, too.
Okay, so we've got back pain, brain stuff. And then the conversation kind of shifts. We get these anecdotes about concussions.
Yeah, he talks about playing rugby, how the head trauma from that has had some long-term effects. And it makes you think about all those other contact sports, too, like
Mm.
UFC.
And remember, he even had that one story, that crazy story about getting a concussion at a wedding.
Right, right. I mean, it's kind of a funny story, but it also highlights how these head injuries, they can happen anywhere and they can have some lasting consequences.
And that's a big deal, right? We're learning more and more about that. Okay, so from personal health, we take a turn into some more societal stuff. Wildfires in California come up, and there's this frustration, this feeling that things are being mishandled.
Yeah. They talk about how resources are being used, how much is being spent on homelessness compared to fire prevention, and then the water shutoffs.
It's a mess. And he kind of goes on a bit about San Francisco, how it's going downhill. And he actually brings up Jared Diamond's book, Collapse. You ever read that?
Yeah, it's a good one. Talks about all these different civilizations throughout history and how they, well, collapsed,
Yeah.
what caused it. Makes you think about what we're doing today.
Totally. And that's where they bring up the Mayans and the Aztecs. These incredibly advanced civilizations that just eventually weren't.
And that's the thing, isn't it? They were advanced. Like he mentions this pyramid in Guatemala that's actually even bigger than the ones in Egypt. Hard to imagine how something that big could just disappear.
And then he ties it back to one of his own films, Apocalypto. That whole idea of how fragile societies can be. And he goes on to talk about some of the problems we're facing today that he thinks could lead to our own collapse.
Right, like the environment, that's a big one.
Right.
But he also brings up this idea of a modern human sacrifice.
Which sounds a little crazy, but then he explains it, like ineffective medical treatments, wars that maybe shouldn't have been fought, all these things that result in a huge loss of life.
It's a different way of thinking about it, for sure. Okay, so we've gone from back pain to the potential collapse of society. And then we switch gears again. We go into filmmaking.
Right. And this is where it gets really interesting, at least for me. Because this guy, he has this really unique approach. He makes films in these ancient languages, like Mayan, Aramaics, Latin.
I mean, that's not something you hear every day. And he has his reasons for doing it. He talks about authenticity, how it creates a different kind of impact. And he compares it to acting in English, which he says is just, well, different.
And it's all connected to his filmmaking process, like with Apocalypto, for example. He says it started with this idea of filming a primal foot chase, and that just grew into this exploration of pre-Columbian America.
And the research he did is fascinating. He talks about Mayan trading canoes, the Popol Vuh, which, by the way, is their sacred creation story. And then there's this amazing detail about the discovery of a mural at El Mirador. 2,600 years old. That's how far back this culture goes.
It's incredible. So he talks about how he finds these stories, the creative process, and he really emphasizes this idea that at the end of the day, filmmaking is about entertainment. Even this story is serious.
Makes sense. You want people to actually watch the movie.
Exactly. He also talks about why he started making films later in life. It was like these stories were always with him, and he just had to get him out there. Like he really wanted to make a Viking movie.
And it's interesting because he gets into some of the challenges he's faced in Hollywood. Specifically, he talks about The Passion of the Christ, which is a pretty controversial film.
Oh, yeah. He says there's a bias against Christian themes in Hollywood.
Yeah.
He tells these stories about how hard it was to get The Passion distributed. Even Rupert Murdoch was apparently worried about it hurting his other businesses.
It's kind of a glimpse behind the curtain, you know, the whole politics of Hollywood.
Definitely. And he even talks about Apocalypto, how it did really well at first, made a lot of money, but then they started pulling it from theaters. Gotta wonder what was going on there.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got ancient languages, Hollywood politics, and then the conversation takes a turn inward. We start getting into beliefs, spirituality, the nature of reality.
And it gets really personal. He starts talking about his own beliefs. He believes in a spiritual realm, a battle between good and evil. And he sees humanity as being right in the middle of it.
He talks about how his faith has evolved over time, how he went from just accepting what he was taught as a kid to really thinking about it, experiencing things that solidified his beliefs.
And then he brings up the Shroud of Turin, which is, well, it's a pretty mysterious thing. There's all this debate about how old it is, how the image was created.
Right, and they specifically mention this nuclear researcher who thinks it's from a certain time period, and then this AI artist who thinks it's from a totally different time.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole question of, could it actually be from the time of Christ?
It's a fascinating mystery. And it kind of leads into a conversation about the Ark of the Covenant. You know, those legends about it being in Ethiopia.
Yeah, and all the danger surrounding it. He also talks about how strongly he believes in the historical existence of Jesus, how the apostles were willing to die for their beliefs, and the resurrection, of course.
Right. He points out that if the apostles were making it all up, why would they be willing to die for it? Doesn't really make sense. And then we get into evolution.
Yeah, he says he just doesn't feel like we came from apes. He's more inclined to believe in creation, although he does say that there could be adaptation within that framework.
It's interesting. And he's also skeptical about carbon dating, especially because of those discoveries at Göbekli Tepe.
Which is a site in Turkey that's really throwing a wrench in some of our timelines. And he goes on to talk about some of his own experiences that he sees as evidence of a higher power. Specifically, he talks about overcoming addiction.
Yeah, those personal stories can be really powerful. And he even talks about this idea of invincible ignorance. Like, what happens to people who never even had the chance to hear about Christianity? Can they still be saved?
It's a big question, a theological question. And then, just to add to the mystery, he tells the story about a spiritual healer in LA who can supposedly do these incredible things. And then another story about a cult leader and these intense spiritual experiences that former members have talked about.
It's a lot to take in. But it really makes you think about the power of belief, right? How it can be used for good or bad. So from spirituality, we move into this fascinating conversation about human nature. He brings up this idea of the gift of not thinking straight.
Which sounds kind of counterintuitive, but he explains it. Like sometimes the best ideas come when you're not trying so hard to be logical, you just let your mind wander.
He also mentions that primal fear of a foot chase, which kind of ties back to his filmmaking stuff. And then he tells the story about how he once acted crazy to get out of a dangerous situation.
Which, you know, in the moment, it might just save your life. It's that animal brain taking over, the fight or flight response. Although he does say that staying in that mode for too long can be bad for you.
It's all about finding that balance, right? And then he starts talking about human nature in general, how we have these flaws, this capacity for both good and evil. He even brings up some historical figures as examples.
It's a bit of a reality check, you know. We like to think we're good, but history tells a different story sometimes. But he also talks about that universal desire for happiness and peace.
Which I think everyone can relate to.
Yeah.
And that's where he brings up heroic stories, real-life examples of bravery, like Desmond Doss, you know, the guy who saved all those soldiers in World War II.
Yeah, and he also tells these stories about SAS soldiers, just amazing acts of courage. And he makes this point about how powerful stories are, how we can learn from them, even if we haven't experienced those things ourselves.
It's like we don't have to jump out of a plane to know that it's probably scary. Stories can teach us that. And then he talks about humility, how sometimes the best way to learn it is through public humiliation.
Ouch, yeah. But I guess there's some truth to that. We all make mistakes, right? And then he gets into this whole reflection on aging, the third act of life, what comes next. It's pretty deep stuff.
He talks about forgiveness, redemption, big themes. And speaking of big themes, we then move into a conversation about media, information, truth.
And right away, he starts expressing this distrust of mainstream media. He feels like they've lost credibility. And he brings up this whole controversy around a certain medical treatment as an example.
Yeah, it's like, who do you trust these days? And he even mentions the idea of curated bestseller lists, censorship, this feeling that we're not getting the full story.
And then he goes on this whole thing about Anthony Fauci, how he handled the AIDS crisis, how he's handling things now. And he specifically brings up Peter Duesberg, who has some pretty different views on AIDS.
It's definitely a controversial topic, and just to be clear, we're not taking sides here. We're just trying to present the ideas that were in the original conversation.
Right, exactly. So he talks about how health issues can be politicized, how sometimes profit is put ahead of people's well-being. He uses monoclonal antibodies as an example.
Which, if you remember, ties back to that earlier idea of human sacrifice. And then he starts talking about natural cures, how he believes they exist for most ailments. He even tells these stories about people with stage 4 cancer who supposedly recovered using alternative treatments.
Like ivermectin, methylene blue. Again, these are just anecdotes. We're not saying these things are cures, but it's interesting to hear these personal experiences.
And he even talks about his own experience quitting smoking using the Alan Carr method and how stem cell therapy helped heal his lungs. It's a pretty amazing story.
It is. And then he gets into climate change. He's skeptical of the narrative that's being pushed. He even mentions this Washington Post article that presents a different perspective on temperature trends.
It's another one of those topics where there's a lot of debate, a lot of different interpretations of the data, so it's important to be informed, to look at all sides of the issue. And that's kind of the theme that runs through this whole conversation about media and information.
Yeah, this idea that there are these narratives, these agendas, and we have to be critical thinkers. We can't just accept everything we're told.
Absolutely. So we've covered a lot of ground here. And finally, we get to these personal reflections on aging. He talks about how the body starts to give up as you get older.
Which is something a lot of us can probably relate to. But he also talks about how important it is to keep pushing yourself, to take care of your body. He mentions things like meditation, cold plunges, saunas, red light therapy, even the hyperbaric chamber.
It's like he's not giving up without a fight. And then he tells this hilarious story about almost hanging himself on a film set.
Sounds like a close call, but it's good to hear he can laugh about it now.
Yeah. And he also talks about how he got into jiu-jitsu and how much it's helped him. It's inspiring, you know. It's never too late to try new things, to challenge yourself.
Totally. And he ends by talking about what's important to him now. Creation, storytelling. He wants to leave a positive impact through his art.
So we went from back pain to the end of the world and back again. It was quite a journey.
It really was. And we covered so much. Health, society, filmmaking, beliefs, human nature. It's amazing how it all ties together.
And for you listening, we hope this deep dive gave you some things to think about, maybe some new perspectives on these big issues.
Even if you don't agree with everything that was said, we hope it sparked some curiosity. That's what we're all about.
So what resonated with you? What questions are still swirling around in your mind? That's the real takeaway from all of this. Keep exploring, keep asking questions.
And keep diving deep.